gentlemen, today is October 29th. I'm your news anchor, Holly Trujillo. We are going to be going over a recap of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which has been a terrifying time for our nation. I'm going to give you the history and background of events that led up to it, and then we'll move on to our reporters. The first event that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis was the building of the Berlin Wall. The building of the Berlin Wall separated East and West Berlin, and it really separated our nation from the communist nation. The next event that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Castro's overthrow of Cuba. Once Castro came into power, many Cubans felt like they should be taking control of their country, and then they decided that they needed a new help and support rather than the United States. They turned to the Soviet Union. On December 19, 1961, Cuba and the Soviet Union became official allies. The biggest event that probably led to this Cuban Missile Crisis, well, one of the biggest, was the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17, 1961, our U.S. troops tried to invade Cuba. It was an unsuccessful mission, and the results from it were hurt feelings on both sides of the equation. The final straw for the Cuban Missile Crisis were the U.S. missiles in Turkey. We have nuclear missiles in Turkey right now, and so the Soviet Union felt like they could have missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis started on October 14th, kind of 15th, when a U.S. U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of the Soviet Union missiles. On October 16th, there was the first ExComm meeting. ExComm is the Executive Committee of National Security Council. It is a group of many political leaders from the President, Vice President, and Secretary of Defense. Our reporter, Jessica, will now fill you in on some of the days.
Thanks, Holly. On Monday, we learned about the crisis at hand. That same day, Kennedy called past presidents Hoover, Truman, and Eisenhower to get their advice. He also formally established the Executive Committee of the National Security Council and demanded that they meet daily. He talked to the cabinet and congressional leaders about the crisis, and lastly, he called Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to update him. On Tuesday, ships of the Naval Quarantine Fleet moved around Cuba, and meanwhile, a Soviet submarine moved into the Caribbean area, which in turn threatened the quarantine. Also, Soviet fighters that were going to Cuba were stopped by the fleet, but only one oil tanker made it through. Lastly, Kennedy met with Ambassador Dahlgren at the Soviet embassy. On Wednesday, Chairman Khrushchev replied to Kennedy's letter from the 23rd. Chairman felt threatened and disrespected, not something we want him to be feeling. A day later, the fighters turn around to go back to Europe, but another oil tanker is checked and is granted passage, only carrying petroleum items. Let's take a break for some lighter news.
Thank you, Jessica, for that very informative story. Next, we're going to interrupt that coverage for news story from Dulce Garcia.
Today, James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for their work in determining the structure of DNA. What a great development in science.
On today's weather forecast, you can see there's a 0% chance of missiles raining from the sky, and a 10% chance of rain, and a 30% chance of snow. Please tune back next week on our daily forecast.
Today, the U.S. launched Ranger 5. It was designed to collect data on space and photograph the moon up close. However, there was a malfunction with the batteries, and sadly, it missed the moon by 450 miles. It will remain in space forever.
Now we're going to go back to Jessica to tell us about the last and final days of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
On Friday, another fighter is stopped by the fleet and searched for contraband military supplies but is granted passage because none were found. We also got pictures of a growing missile site and the uncrating of Soviet IL-28 bombers at a Cuban airfield. We found out about a letter that Castro sent to the chairman. Castro urged him to strike the U.S. if we ever tried to invade. On Saturday, one of our very own U-2 planes was shot down over Cuba, and Major Rudolph Anderson was killed. Kennedy sends his condolences to the family and awarded Anderson the Distinguished Service Medal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Now to end our coverage on the Cuban Missile Crisis is Alice Park giving us the results of what the results were for our country.
Thank you. The results of the Cuban Missile Crisis is finally at ease. The Soviet Union withdrew their nuclear missiles from Cuba, Turkey, and Italy. The Soviet Union agreed with the U.S. that they wouldn't invade Cuba without direct provocation. The nuclear hotline was created, which is direct communication between us and the Soviets. I am Alice, and thank you for listening. Back to you.
Halloween is 2 days away, and we have sure been in the Halloween spirit. Again, at the top single is Monster Mash by Bobby Boris Pickett and the Crypt Kickers.
I was working in the lab late one night when my eyes beheld an eerie sight. For my monster from his
Well, isn't that a great single? I'm sure we'll be listening it for all the years to come. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. So, the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis was very, very depressing. What?
Today, the U.S. launched Ranger 5. It was designed to collect data.
Cuban Missile Crisis. Alice, stop it!
The Cuban Missile Crisis was finally at ease. The withdrawal of the Soviet Union. I'm good.
Oh. One of the first events that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yes, okay. Stop.
Today, the U.S. launched Ranger 5. It was designed to collect data about space and photograph. Oh no.
Oh.